tonight's Alpha Talk with DFW Alphas, the Dallas Alphas. My name is Daniel Keeling, and my co-host tonight is my fraternity brother, former Councilman, Dallas City Councilman Eric Wilson. This program is sponsored by the Alpha Sigma Lambda chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated in Dallas. Our philanthropy, Alpha Married, mentors young men in the Dallas areas and has given out over $125,000 scholarships since 1968. We are honored to have Jim Schutze with us tonight, author of the book, The Accommodation. He was a city columnist for a long time with the Dallas Observer and now with The Magazine. He is the recipient of the Association of Alternative News Weeklies Awards for Best Commentary and Lincoln University's National Unity Award for writing on civil rights. In 2011, he was admitted into the prestigious Texas Institute of Letters. Welcome, Mr. Schutze. How are you doing this evening?
Good. Thank you for having me.
We appreciate you coming out tonight. Myself and Eric, we're big fans of your big book, The Accommodation, and lots of members of our generation are aware, and you know, it's becoming a big thing to know about the accommodation and the civil rights movement here in Dallas. It's not something that's really taught much here in Dallas, and to find a book like yours out there, and you know, and not well known in Dallas is like really surprising to us.
Mm-hmm.
How did you even come up with the idea to write a book like The Accommodation?
I had been here about 8 years, 7-8 years from Detroit, where I grew up. Been a reporter and a columnist for the Dallas Times Herald. I went the Ronald Reagan re-election Republican convention was here, and I was covering it. And the gentleman who gave the invocation was the Reverend W.A. Criswell from First Baptist Church.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a very long invocation. And in it, he was speaking to the Republican Party of America. You know, it was the national convention.
Right.
And so he told this story about Dallas, that Dallas had never had any racial issue of any kind, that everything here had always been peaceful and everybody loved it exactly the way it was. And he kind of suggested that was because Dallas had never allowed any trouble.
Okay.
And he was also suggesting that was what the Republican Party needed to do. That's what the country needed to do, was come back the Dallas way. And I guess he got under my skin because he referred to the decaying cities of the Rust Belt. Well, that meant Detroit, where I'm from.
Yes.
I didn't like that. But I also thought this is crazy. I mean, whatever else you say about any place in the country, the clock doesn't go backwards. And it always seemed to me that if Dallas was out of step with the rest of the country, and it was in some significant ways, that meant it had a lot of work to do. That the thing it needed to do was catch up, but not go backwards. So I had a conversation with a guy who was a new editor for a Dallas publishing company, Tailored Publishing. He was another white guy like me. His name's Bobby Frazee, but he grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. And I asked him if he thought Dallas was weird, and he said, yeah, it is. He said Birmingham had to go through certain things, white people in Birmingham, that they didn't want to go through, but they had to, because history came along and the civil rights movement came along and kind of took them by the scruff of the neck and said, things are changing now. And you don't have to like it, but things are changing. And he felt that Birmingham really was a better place for that white people in particular, got more up to speed with reality and the real world around them and stopped living in this weird dream world of white. Right. So he and I agreed that whatever was going on in Dallas with us white folks was not a good thing. And that this story that was being told, that everybody here had always just been happy and liked it the way it was, couldn't be true. So we agreed that I would see if there was a book project in it. And I talked to, because I was a journalist, just a newspaper columnist, but I talked to people who were real historians.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went back through the newspapers of the 40s and 50s and back, the best sources I could get. And what I found was that if everybody was happy here, how come people were bombing homes?
That's what got me, was the number
Yes.
of bombings I saw in your book. And I was like, nobody's ever said anything about bombings in Dallas. I mean, I have a degree in history, and I never heard about bombing.
No.
It's something I never heard about. I heard about Birmingham,
Right.
and all these other northern cities, Chicago, Detroit, whatever. I never heard about, bombings of Dallas, just never heard of that.
And the late Comer Cottrell, the entrepreneur, very wealthy man who worked and lived around this country and done business in Africa. And he said to me, well, bombings happened everywhere. There were bombings in your Detroit. There were bombings in other cities in the South. And I said, yeah, but we know about that. People in those cities don't lie and say that it never happened. And,
True.
And they don't believe that it never happened. So anyway, Frazee and I decided that was a story that was worth telling. And that's how the book came about.
Right. And early on in your book, you talk about, one of the things that kind of struck me when I started reading is that at one point of your book, you said at one time in the 20s that 1/3 of all white males were part of the Klan. They ran the city.
Yeah.
And in 1923 at the fair, they had like 1,000 show up here in Dallas. Day.
I was not too long ago helping a neighbor move some old family. This is a white person. Move some old family heirlooms, and they've been packed in newspapers since the 20s or 30s. But you could still read the newspapers. And so I took this newspaper out. It was not a Dallas paper, it was a Denton paper. But it talked about a wonderful Ku Klux Klan picnic and how many people showed up and what the ladies baked, what kind of pies they made. And they had a wonderful old-timey cross lighting at the picnic.
Mm.
And this was like a story that was back inside the newspaper. And it just made me realize the Ku Klux Klan was a part of normal life here. Normal with quote marks.
Right.
Woven so deep in the culture. And you can't just turn that off like a light switch. I mean, that's the roots of history.
Absolutely.
And you have to know that.
Right. And one of the things that got me staying on the Clinton subject a little bit, as everybody moves to Dallas, Dallas is weird. All the freeways have names. They're not just I-35. They're not 635.
Right.
They actually, so you're calling these people's names out every day. And the first name that struck me in your book that I came across was R.L. Thornton. And then I found out who R.L. Thornton was. Can you kind of explain to people who R.L. Thornton was and what he was to Dallas?
Right. Well, R.L. Thornton was the guy who put together the great state fair exhibition of the 30s. And he really created, was the shotgun behind what we now call the Dallas Citizens Council. And he was a very high official in the Klan. And people in Dallas talk about the freeway families.
Mm-hmm.
The names are on the freeways, otherwise known as Ku Klux Klan families from that era. It's just so baked in. This is off topic, but R.L. Thornton was a founder of this Dallas Citizens Council. The Dallas Citizens Council is still very important in Dallas. The chairman of the board up until recently was an African American. I don't mean to say that the Dallas Citizens Council today is a Ku Klux Klan group, but whenever the Dallas Citizens Council comes up, when I'm talking to journalists from other cities, they always say immediately, man, isn't that one of those white citizens councils from the 50s that fought integration? It's not. It has a separate history. The Dallas Citizens Council is not the white citizens council, but everyone elsewhere always thinks it is. So by now, wouldn't you think about changing your name?
I kind of have a little insight on that. And,
okay.
There were some discussions, believe it or not. There were some discussions about that possibly being done, but of course,
really?
Yeah. During the tenure of the individual who was the past president, so that was an opportunity, and in recognition of what you just said, to separate themselves from that perception. So I yes, that was discussed, but it never came to fruition. And just along that lines, there's a quote that you have, and it's kind of tied this all in. Dallas likes its history the way it likes its race relations, hidden, out of sight, and avoided at all costs.
Yeah.
So do you feel that this is still true in race relations in Dallas today?
Well, I don't feel that it's been true for a couple decades coming from the Black community. I think Black leadership has spent some time and blood and sweat in the last couple decades insisting on change with some, striking successes from the white side of the dial. I still run into this just remarkable ignorance of the past. Now we're talking about older people.
Mm-hmm.
It's very different, I find, with young white people. And I think that, there was this new interest in my book starting 10 years or so ago, and I couldn't figure out why. I figured the book was just forgotten. But they were all young people. Most, not all, but mostly white. A lot of white young people who had moved into the city. And a lot of them grew up in the suburbs, and they wanted to come live in North Oak Cliff and so on. And they're looking at these facts on the ground, that there's a border across the city, and that there are two sectors in the city, and they sure looks like they're divided black and white. And I realized if you grew up in Plano or Frisco, your life is probably pretty diverse. For kids who are young now, they had white kids, I call them 20-somethings who grew up there, had black friends, Asian friends, Hispanic friends. And they were told that racism was solved. It's over. It was a thing in history. They had this really great preacher named Martin Luther King. He went and asked the white people to be nicer, and they agreed, and that was it. It was all over. So now they move into the city, and they find this reality that is not explained. Nobody's ever told them. People have lied to them and said it's over, and it ain't over. And B, no one's ever explained why. And I think that they've gravitated to my book. I wish they had a newer, better book. I wish one of them would write a book that would bring it up to today. But it in White Metropolis, my book's a little easier for non-historians to read because I'm not a historian. But they are searching, and I want to give them credit for it. They are searching for an explanation for why the city looks the way it does.
Right. And do you think that's partially a problem of kind of maybe the black church establishment that was here, that was working the accommodations with ministers like S.M. Wright? I understand, like, looking at one of your other interviews, and you said you ran across him later, like in the 80s or something, and he was like, "You owe me," like, or something.
Yeah.
That you had something with him or something.
I try to put some of this history out of my head, but yes. We had a meeting at the Times Herald. I forget what the immediate issue was, but we had a brand new publisher who'd come from New York like that week. He'd never been to Dallas before. And SM and a group of ministers came in. They were real mad at me. Oh, because I'd said they turned their back on Dr. King when he came to town. And they wanted a retraction. And the new publisher was kind of looking at me like, just agree to this. Just say you'll do a retraction. What are you talking about? They turned their backs on MLK. This is the black leadership. They wouldn't have done that. And they were about to win. And that was when SM said to the publisher, you owe us because we kept the civil rights movement down here. So the publisher says, hey, do you mind if I have a little private talk with Mr. Schutze here? So the ministers all left the room, and the publisher says, what are they talking about? They kept the civil rights movement down. And I just said, sir, it's a long story. And this is not a hero story about myself. I said, tell you what, why don't we just find a way to apologize for this incident and get out of it? Because I'm never going to be able to explain to this guy from New York what's going on. And he just wants it to go away. He's brand new. So I forget what we did, but it came out to be what SM wanted. Reverend Wright was the gentleman who usually got his way. I don't know if you ever dealt with him. I guess not.
No.
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 That's what I'm
He's
saying.
a very forceful character.
The freeway thing is like, that's the first thing that, every time, I would read something in your book and it would come back to another person that the freeway's named after. And I'm going, he doesn't need something named after him. What's the hell's
Right.
going on in the city, Which brings me back to the book, and the accommodation. You talk about, them basically taking West Dallas, with them just basically taking West Dallas,
Yeah.
Could you kind of let them know a little bit about that?
And turning it into, taking West Dallas and turning it into an industrial zone. Now they're taking it back again and turning it into expensive apartments. But before it was an industrial zone, West Dallas, a lot of it was unincorporated in the city. It was occupied by whatever, you can say poor people, you can also say working people. And they owned their own property. And a lot of the houses were small, and some of them, people had built onto them themselves. There were infrastructure problems, sewerage and so on, because the city hadn't put it there. It's kind of like Sand Branch in some ways. The city had withheld infrastructure, but those people owned those houses.
Right.
That was home ownership. So there was a big campaign in the morning news how terrible conditions are in West Dallas. Terrible, unconscious, and they had talk about pandemics, they had everything. Bad infant mortality, that's what happens when you don't extend public health to an area. But I still go back to the fact that these people owned those houses. So the morning news has this big campaign in the 50s. Oh, the conditions were terrible there. We got to do something. So what they did was to use eminent domain to condemn everybody out of their houses, seize the land for their purposes, industrial purposes, and then the compensation was public housing, government housing, the huge, gigantic public housing complexes, some of which around Fish Trap Lane. Most of the old stuff has been demolished. And so you move everybody into, so you cut off home ownership. You chop that off at the knees, and you move everybody into this gigantic public housing complex that some people would call, I forget what those were called in South Africa, settlements.
Yeah.
And that stuff is then in the 90s, there were lawsuits that forced the government to shut a lot of that stuff down.
Right. That's something else. The more I read your book, and I could just see the neighborhoods kind of forming, the geography of kind of how things were forming in Dallas.
Yeah.
When they decided they need to do something, then they would move people to another location. Kind of brings me to Hamilton Park, with the wealthier African Americans move into South Dallas. No, we don't need to do that. We need to get them guys out there in the middle of nowhere, and the accommodation, you talk about Hamilton Park. Can you kind of talk about the formation of Hamilton Park a little bit?
Well, it came along at a time when the black leadership was, because of the bombings, going to the white leadership and saying, this ain't gonna last. This is not, and they used the time-honored, I think, strategy of all revolution. The ministers said, now you can trust us, but it's those young men. We can't control them. So the young men are always the weapon that has to be used to scare the establishment. And so they said, there's got to be a pressure release valve here. Dallas now has a substantial number of African-American families who can afford to make down payments and make the payments on good middle-class housing. And it is not available anywhere. And we're jammed into these neighborhoods, and this is intolerable. And there were some people in the white leadership, very few, a guy named John Carpenter, who said, and the W.H. Cawthron, who said, look, this is a good thing. This is African-American people who worked hard and they're successful and they've saved their money and they want to invest. Why wouldn't we encourage this? And so out of that came the idea of Hamilton Park, which initially the first idea was to put this community right in the floodway, which is where the white power structure would always put black people, right in front of the flood. And so there was enough pushback to say, no, that's not probably, I've wondered in looking back on it, they probably knew they couldn't get mortgage money if they put the thing in front of the flood. So anyway, it moved to Hamilton Park, which was safe, dry land. Hamilton Park, if you talk to Donald Payton, who grew up in Hamilton Park was an object of enormous pride. Donald grew up there. He told me how black people came from Louisiana just to look at Hamilton Park. And, here are black people living in brand new, nice houses, immaculate lawns.
Right.
This is the dream. This is what can happen. The downside of Hamilton Park was, that the leadership agreed to back off on more aggressive techniques.
Right. It sounds like to me, just kind of reading the book and looking at both sides, it looked like that Dallas always gave the African-American population just enough to keep them from. I was kind of reading a story about, you were talking about the bus integration of Dallas, and how, they would move the signs on the bus, whatever.
Oh, yes.
And how they would move it back and forth on the buses and things like that until they didn't have to, and they integrated their buses overnight, whereas other places had problems. It was just kind of whenever they had to do it, then they did it.
Yeah.
Am I kind of the right place there?
Yes. And there's also some mystery in it. I've learned more since than I knew then, that in every city there was some element of white leadership that was willing to do that, compromise just enough to head off trouble. There was an offer in Little Rock from the white leadership to integrate the schools, sort of. And part of the history of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and Dr. King, everybody portrays King now as almost a pacifist or something. But my understanding, no, my understanding was that in Little Rock and Birmingham, when that white element offered to compromise, King said, "No, we're going for the fight. You know, the fight is important here, and this is how we achieve moral change." Peter Johnson and also Reverend Zan Holmes have said to me that there was a difference in Dallas because the church leadership, well, African American church leadership in Dallas, had a split from King within the church, that there was an opposition to King that was centered in Dallas. And so King had a negative feeling about Dallas and figured, I got other fish to fry. If I'm going to go out there and get my head bloodied, I'm going to do it in Birmingham or Selma, but not Dallas. And that was great with Dallas's black leadership because they didn't want him to come here and do it.
And can you talk a little bit more about that?
About why they didn't want him to come, or
the black clergy being against that, and some of the reasons why, and their connections with the white business leaders.
Well, again, my feelings about this have evolved since I wrote the book, and I've had a chance to talk to black historians and writers who are smarter about some of this stuff than me, who've said, look, well, if you look back to that period, all the white people are running around in bed sheets. Exactly what was it about white people that would make black people want to go live with them? What was it that black people would really admire and want to mix with? So there's always been a significant separatist sentiment. That I think that's the history of our country and the struggle, that black people have always struggled between separatism and more confrontational assimilationism. And I mean, the other side of separatism is always, I don't want to be told which piece of the pie you're going to give me. When I was at the Detroit Free Press, which it was a black dominant city, the paper was the newsroom was 95% white. And we had a big project. What do black people want? What do they want? And we were going to divide up in teams and go out and ask everybody, what do black people want? So there was a black reporter in the room who had not been consulted. And she said, could I just sit in on the next meeting you guys are having? And they said, okay. So Susan Watson, it's really smart. She sat in and they said, Susan, we're going to do a 5-part series on what black people want. And she said, oh, you don't need to do 5 parts. You can do it in 1 sentence. And they said, what's that? And she said, everything you got. Just everything. Not a piece of the pie, the pie. Same like you, we'll all sit at the table and eat the pie. We don't have to have a slice of the pie passed somewhere. So I think there's always been that division, and the leadership in the black church in Dallas, for its own reasons, leaned towards separatism.
Okay.
Well, I just had a question. Like I said, I've read your writings and loved your style, and after I read the Accommodations, it took me a little bit to gather myself, and once you learn the history from the standpoint. But I always had this question I wanted to ask you. What are some of the things that the publisher then made you remove out of this book?
I don't think. Well, now asking a 75-year-old person memory of these things. I don't think we got to that point of taking things out at all. We were very aware. The editor and I were very aware a few months before publication that Alex Bickley, who was the executive director of the Citizens Council, was on the warpath to get this book shut down. And so we hurried it up. And I think we hurried it up and I left some stuff out. I can't blame anybody for making me take it out. I just think that I left out some very significant.
Right. You mentioned Johnson a while ago, and one of your stories in your book was about about a parade, about a parade.
Yes.
Peter Johnson and Al Lipscomb about the parade around.
Oh yeah.
With us about that. Sure.
Well, this is when the Citizens Council was pushing this thing to use eminent domain again to basically seize a black neighborhood around Fair Park. And they announced to the black homeowners that the law required them to pay the market value of the property. So some of the property was owned by white people. So they offered the white people twice what they offered the black people. And the black people went to the city and said, you said you were going to give market value. How come they're getting twice? And the city said, well, property is worth more if it's owned by white people.
Mm-hmm.
So you have this thing that has this element of white that's sort of crazy, that self-defines the situation and the rules. And so Peter led an effort to go back to them and say, this is just illegal. The Supreme Court has ruled on this stuff. You know, Peter was with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and he wasn't supposed to be involved here, but he couldn't stand what was going on with eminent domain. So he went to the city and he said, this is illegal. And the mayor wouldn't meet with him. The mayor was Eric Johnson with a K. Not Eric Johnson. No. Yeah, with a K, and they spelled it Johnson differently. Different Eric.
Correct.
Johnson. So he would not meet with this group. So that for the first time in history, the Cotton Bowl Parade was going to be nationally broadcast on one of the national networks. And so Peter said, okay, if you don't, Mayor Johnson, if you don't meet with us, we're going to go out and stop the parade when it's on national TV. And they gathered in the church on MLK. It's a Lutheran church. The night before, they gathered in the basement, and they got a threat that people would be killed if they demonstrated. And they had a moment where Peter drew a line across the basement. He said, look, if you don't want to do this, nobody's going to say a word. You can go home. And anybody who wants to do it, come across this line. Nobody came across the line until Al Lipscomb did. He came across the line and said, I'm doing it. And then everybody came across the line. And so that morning, they were forming up to stop the parade. And they get this last minute call, the mayor will meet with you. The mayor will meet with you. And they said, yeah, okay, but just as a gesture of good faith, we want to be in the parade. And so they said, well, all right, one of your group, you, Reverend Johnson. Peter was this young, guy from Atlanta and sort of a known guy. You can be in the parade. And Peter said, I want Al Lipscomb in the parade. And they said, no, he can't be in the parade. And Peter said, no, there's no deal unless Al is in the parade. And so they agreed at the last minute. And so the parade goes down MLK, I think it was called Forest then.
Forest Avenue.
Forest Avenue.
And here are the network cameras and everything. And Al, of course, is doing the parade wave, the King of England wave to everybody. Yeah, that's right. To make sure that he is seen. And Peter said it brought tears to his eyes because there were all these people from that community who were out there staring, thinking, damn, we did this. We forced that arrogant blank, blank, blank to put Peter in the car, to put Al in the car. And I was,
wow.
Whatever you say about Al at the end of his career, that was raw physical courage.
Yeah. He gets overlooked, here in Dallas, especially by the younger generation, because we only caught the tail end of his career. We didn't catch him in his heyday, and there are resources out there. Another name that I came across in your book, and it just really I have a whole new respect for this individual. I've seen his store forever, Neiman Marcus, Stanley Marcus.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, my God, man. I did not know, that about him, Right. And one of the things you had in your book was he sent a telegram to Washington basically telling them not to allow Kennedy to come to Dallas.
A week before. Yeah.
A week before the assassination, telling them because the atmosphere in Dallas was so tense that to not even know. And then you mentioned about some other people that had been shot or attacked here in Dallas before that. And I majored in history. I didn't know any of this stuff,
Well, I was thinking about all that during Trump and on January 6th. And who's responsible? I asked Marcus, do you think Dallas killed Kennedy? And he said, absolutely it did. He said, not with some stupid conspiracy theory with Cuba and the mafia and everything. He said, if you maintain and encourage an atmosphere like that, where you're egging on the trouble, you're begging for the trouble, some crazy guy will go out and do it for you. And you know that when you're calling for the trouble. And he said, that's what Dallas did. And he said, that's why he sent the telegram to Washington. And I thought of it because I thought, Trump claims that he had nothing to do with this. That's ridiculous. It's the president. He was begging for it.
I had no idea that Fulbright, the Fulbright scholarship that everybody gets or had got attacked in Dallas, had gotten attacked here in Dallas. So I had no idea that these things that even occurred, before.
And the stuff that preceded that was going on before the assassination with all the right-wing stuff. This is something I didn't get in the book because I didn't have time, but people since have told me, people who were from that era, the white people who were present for some of that, said the scariest people on the far right wing, everybody talks about the John Birch Society and the men, the white guys in the suits. People told me, no, it was their wives. That's who went out and was spitting on Adlai Stevenson, the ambassador to the UN. That's who was attacking Fulbright. They had this uniform they wore, red, white, and blue dresses, which sounds a little familiar these days. and said they were the scary ones. They were the ones out there with their protest signs, whacking on people.
Right. And that was pretty much desegregation here in Dallas. Also, it was the women who were normally at protest. Yeah. That's wild.
But we better not go too far with that because I see only men here. We're just there's no future in this.
I got you.
It's not going in a good direction.
Yeah, we've talked a lot this evening or whatever, and we want to open it up to a few questions. Forrest, have you got any questions for us this evening? Mr. Schutze, we really appreciate your time. We really do.
Really do.
Any
Appreciate
questions, guys? Anything from the audience that you guys want to ask this gentleman here? Like I said, he's a wealth of knowledge. I'm just enjoying talking to you this evening. My only question for you is: are you ever going to teach this as a class? Are you ever going to like have a 5-part series where you just going to teach this book or anything? Or
I don't. I thank you. That's very flattering. I don't think so. I've got a writing project. I actually retired from D. I got along great with them. They're great folks, but I retired because I got a writing project I want to finish up. I'm 75. I don't know. I'm in good health. Thank you. I'm knocking on wood when I say that. But I don't know when the big piano falls on my head. I want to get this done. So.
I got you. Forrest is working on the questions for us, it looks like here. So coming back to your book just a little bit, just a couple things. Like I said, we kind of jumped all over the place and we really missed some of the major points of your book. And I do apologize for that. And that's me and my enthusiasm of just talking to you. One of the major people we didn't talk anything about Henry Wade. We didn't mention anything about in his
about
Henry Wade.
Henry Wade.
Oh,
Henry
yeah.
Wade.
Yeah. Interesting, because he was the young DA, brand new DA, who investigated the bombings. And it was clear to me in reading about that. Oh, he was the DA, but boy, he was just the Citizens Council had him by the collar.
Right.
That's who was running. They had this so-called blue ribbon grand jury to investigate the bombings.
Right.
And I investigated Mr. Wade when he was at the end of his career, old man, I guess about the age I am now. And I said, what is a blue ribbon grand jury? And he said, oh, there's really no such thing. We just made that up. He said, in the law, there are grand juries.
Right.
The law, the law tells you what a grand jury is. He said, there's no such thing as a blue ribbon grand jury made up of the Dallas Citizens Council. But they made it up, and he ran it, and he investigated it. When I interviewed him, when he was an elderly gentleman, I said, how come you never really I said, it sounds to me like you uncovered just incredible things, these church groups that were involved in organizing the bombings. But you didn't bring any charges.
Yeah.
You didn't bring any criminal follow-up. And he said, well, we told them to stop, and they did. And I said, yeah, I know you told them to stop, and they did, but like if somebody kills somebody, you don't say, now don't ever do that again. And that's it. The law is the law. And he kind of said, well, we handle things our own way here. And we put a stop to it, and that was good enough for us.
I mean, his son, he had the two brothers, and then you had brought in, it was like, okay. And that really shocked me that it was a Hispanic guy, that was involved in some as too.
Right.
Or related. I know how black-brown relations are kind of now here in Dallas, just a little bit. I mean, was there a different relationship between black people and Hispanics during that time period? I mean, were they?
You talk about another touchy topic somebody needs to write a book about. But back in those days, Hispanics were white. They put whites only signs in their yards. And then it was in the 60s when more of a consciousness grew up and a lot of consciousness with the farm workers union and so on. And people said wisely, the white people aren't taking us as white. There's this weird thing about definitions of race. White people define other people as races. And so do you have to accept that? I mean, this is a tangled web. I always think that the real conversation I've decided in my old age that I'm tired of hearing white people discussing our feelings about Black people or about Hispanic people. I'm really interested in having a conversation of white people talking about what we think about white people. What do we think that is? What do we think it means? If it's not the color. If I were this color, I hope you would call 911. I mean, that's clearly not what it means.
Gotcha.
So what does it mean? Where do these definitions
Where they even
come
come
from?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if in your book and you talk about the creation, going back to the beginning, the creation of Dallas and how it was formed and how slaves were treated in Dallas, the thread that goes through your book is that sentiment in terms of how whites saw themselves and how whites saw others
and
blacks.
back when, and I think it's important to go back to the earliest days during slavery and after, when the guy who wrote the book 10 Years a Slave, is that the right title?
12 Years a Slave.
12 years. I didn't see the movie, but I read his journal. He was a really interesting writer, and he wrote about how the one thing you could threaten slaves with in Louisiana was that they would be sent to Texas. That Texas was really scary and harsh. And I read through these bulletins that were sent back by the agents of the Freedmen's Bureau from Dallas to Washington during Reconstruction. It's horrifying, really scary. And I don't think you can get to the present without going back to that past. Not even so much for what that did to Black people. Yes, that's a part of it. But what did that do to white people? How did white people be like that? What did they have to do to their souls to be like that? And then when they say today, well, we don't remember any of that. Nah, it never happened. That means to me that the soul hasn't been repaired.
Or even addressed.
The work of the soul has not been done. And that's a conversation that's about white folks. Anyway.
Boris, you said you had a couple questions for us. You want to put one of those up on the screen for us or jump in with us? We have a question from Asa. What do you think about the activism in Dallas today? What do you think about that?
Well, after George Floyd, during the demonstration, somebody called me up and said, there's a George Floyd demonstration in the Park Cities. And I thought, oh, those poor people, they're crazy. Why would they go there? That's nuts. So I got video of it online, and it was Park Cities people marching.
Right.
Which to me was, wow. I didn't know that was physically possible. I don't want to, if you talk too much about the white allies in the George Floyd demonstrations, it becomes one of those arguments that, so it's all solved. We're past it. We're in a post-racial era. That'd be idiotic to say. But I absolutely, there was another demonstration around SMU. And I went out and walked in that one. And that was, there were a lot of African-American people taking part, but that was majority white kids and faculty from SMU. And I'm sorry, but that is a change. I don't know exactly what it means, but it's a big change from my youth. And I find generally when I talk to young white people, they're so much farther, they're not over it, but they're so much farther down the road than my generation that they can't even understand my generation. They don't know what we're talking about. So I think that the activism of today is materially, substantially different I don't know where it goes because I don't have a crystal ball. That doesn't necessarily mean, oh boy, we're in for peace and roses.
Correct.
Could mean we're in for bigger trouble.
Or
But it's different. It's different.
are you gonna? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's
When your book is released, are you going to have any book signings or anything like that? Are you going to actually go out and actually doing any touring with your book or anything?
yes. This small publishing house that's republishing it is called Deep Vellum. They're doing a really great job. Man, they're going back through the whole thing. They're calling me up all the time with spelling errors, some factual errors. They've gone through it with a fine-tooth comb. And they're a very small place, and I want to help them be successful with it. So I have been paid a modest fee at the get-go, and then that's it. I don't get any more money out of it, but I want to help them make a success of it.
Along that line, since it is set to come out again, just a question, in your opinion, who would best benefit from reading your book in 2021?
Well, I feel very strongly, I don't want to shortchange African-American readers, but I feel very strongly that white people are the people who need to read this book. When it came out, it was very heavily suppressed and censored. Reverend Criswell of First Baptist Church went on National Baptist Radio, and he said that the book was pornography, and that good Baptists were not to read it. For a long time, I thought the only white person who read it in Dallas was my mother. Oh, wow. And it was to this day. I hate to bore you with another anecdote, but I got invited to a Park City's women's book club just a couple of years ago in like 2018. Mm-hmm. And they introduced me by, they thought the book was just coming out in 1986. And they said, Mr. Schutze is a Dallas journalist. He's come out with a very interesting book. He has discovered that we have a racial problem in Dallas. This is like 2018. And I almost walked out. I thought, oh my God. Of course, that's the extreme bubble. But I still feel that that white people generally in the city would be so much better equipped to make it a better city and to get things done and to deal with people if they just knew the history.
Absolutely. And we appreciate your time this evening. Like I said, we don't want to keep you all evening. I could talk to you all day.
Yeah, we can go on for hours.
Well, I'm looking on my calendar here. All it says for today is take cholesterol pill. So I'm pretty open.
Well, maybe that'll lead us to maybe our part two.
Part two.
I'll have you back.
Or just a dinner. And it looks like we got another question that just came in for us. Go ahead, Forrest. Question. Yeah. Is the question about the RSR lead smelter contamination in West Dallas?
Yes, it absolutely was targeted to West Dallas. It had everything to do with West Dallas. It had to do with, I said before that all of the homeowners were moved out. That's not true. The bulk, a huge swath of homeowners were moved out, but a number of people remained. So they got lead smelters as their new neighbors. Mm-hmm. And there was terrible contamination. More recently, in the 2010s, and Councilman Wilson knows this history probably better than I do, but there was the whole controversy over the cleanup, mm-hmm. And that, yes, that's a terrible part of the saga.
Yeah, and when I first moved to Dallas, and I worked for the council's office, full disclosure, back in the early 2000s, whatever, and I would go out to houses and doing an eviction, and a lady was telling me that when they were moving the dirt from the smelter, people would take dirt from the smelter, as they were moving it out or whatever, and they would pour it in their yards or whatever,
Yeah.
Smelter.
Well, but there's another wrinkle to that I'd just like to mention. There was an African American council member, Elsie Faye Higgins, and the initial plan was to dig up all the dirt from West Dallas and dump it in South Dallas, just massively. And so Mrs. Higgins went to war against that, said, you're not doing that. And there was a concerted effort, and that didn't happen. So then there was a plan to take all the dirt to Pleasant Grove and dump it. And the Pleasant Grove council member at that time was a white guy named Max Goldblatt.
Okay, Max, yeah.
And so there was a community meeting where Max Goldblatt got up and started in on a rave about how terrible Mrs. Higgins was. Obstructionist, trouble, won't go along with anything. And people I know who were there got up and said, wait a minute, she protected her district from the lead dirt, and now they're going to dump it on us, and you're not doing anything. And it was the beginning of a whole new activism in that part of Dallas, Buckner Terrace and other neighborhoods. It was also an example to me of how white people learned from the Black council members that, yeah, your council member is supposed to actually stick up for you. Your council member is not, when the Citizens Council says they're going to dump the lead dirt on you, your council member is supposed to say no, not yes. Absolutely. And I felt in that sense that the Black struggle and Black leadership in the city very much informed the subsequent development of the so-called neighborhood movement, which was more white and more north, but taking its lead from those single-member district African-American council members.
Right. And
that's a mouthful right there.
A good stopping point, I'll get into 14-1 and, and wonderful things, but, like I say, we're coming up on an hour. So we don't want to bring
annexation of Oak Cliff and East Dallas. We haven't talked about all that. It's just so much.
About here, Highland Park. I mean, like, there's much to your book. There's no way to cover it within an hour.
Yeah.
No way to even get close. But we wanted to give, people who are watching tonight with us a little bit of flavor about your book, and let everybody know that it was coming back out again. And there are some ghost copies out there floating on PDF out there, still a little bit right there, but we don't want y'all to get those anymore. Book there. So, but go on Amazon and get your copy of this book, and read up on it. It comes out in September. We want everybody to be educated about Dallas. That's big goals here. In our fraternity is we're all about educating people about what's going on in the local community.
Well, this discussion for me is a whole lot more satisfying than the one in the Park Cities where they said I discovered there might be a racial problem.
We know just a little bit more. Yes,
I'd much rather do this. Yeah.
We have enjoyed you. We've enjoyed the time with you. Like I said, we could spend hours in discussion about the book, and we just want to, before we go, we want to give you an opportunity to either plug your book or just have some closing words.
Well, I thank you. It's an honor to be here. It's from the time the book was published. What is it? 45 years ago. The vast majority of my conversations about it have been with groups like yours, and they've been with African American groups, and where there's great awareness. And one of the reactions to the book when it came out from some groups was disappointment. People who said, we knew all this stuff. We thought you had something new to tell us. The great frustration is on the white side of that line, and I hope that I truly believe that the young people, that it's young people who brought about this republication of the book. And I think they truly do represent change for the better. And sometimes in my old age, I think the only way we're going to get this thing done is to have a lot more funerals.
Classic Jim. Classic.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks very much.
What was it? I read a great number of obituaries with great. I see. He said that he read a great number. He said he was not a killer, but he's read a great number of obituaries with great pleasure.
Yeah, I get that. I absolutely get that.
Oh, thank you, sir. Just
Thank
hang
you.
on after this. Everybody, thank you for joining us with Alpha
Thanks for
Talk,
joining us.
DFW Alphas or Dallas Alphas, Alpha Sigma Lambda chapter, part of South Dallas. We're right there on Al Lipscomb Way. Hopefully, in the next couple of months, we'll be coming back to our frat house as soon as the pandemic breaks. Jim, like I say, we want to invite you over as soon as we kind of come back or whatever. And hey, we got to get you a drink. Get me, you, and Eric got to
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Well, thank you. I'll say goodbye.
All
All
right.
right.
See
Thank
ya.
you. Have a great evening.
Bye-bye.